Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, Russia has made some big moves in Ukraine, have been widely denounced by the United States and other Western powers. Talk a little bit about what Russia has done to the territorial integrity of Ukraine.
So over the last week or so, Russian-occupied territories in Ukraine, there are 4 of them really, held referendum votes. And they overwhelmingly came back in favor of joining the Russian Federation, but these are not legitimate votes. We heard from the White House, who denounced this, describe people being forced to vote under gunpoint.
Right.
We've heard even them preemptively months ago acknowledge that there was a chance that Russia would sort of go through their playbook of, conducting a referendum, forging the results, and then using that as a pretext to annex the territory, which we're now seeing that President Putin will sign, an agreement later this week to formalize the annexation process.
Right.
And it is similar to the 2014 playbook from Crimea, which is something that the administration has mentioned a lot. Now, it is interesting that this is happening because it really does demonstrate a significant escalation in the war.
Right.
We've heard about this as a potential and a possibility, but it really does raise the stakes. And we've heard significant condemnation from everyone from the White House to DOD. We've heard condemnations from NATO, from European leaders. It really has been only messages of condemnation from pretty much the entire Western Front. And so moving forward, it does raise the stakes as to what will happen next because the U.S. Announced a new military aid package for another billion plus.
Right.
And so providing weapons to Ukraine will now put a little bit more pressure in Ukraine itself because Russia will view attacks on these territories as attacks on their own territory. And so it does heighten or potentially elevate the risk that the U.S. and Ukraine face moving forward.
So, I mean, obviously, the White House and Western line has generally been that these are sham referendums. That's the phrase they tend to use to describe them. They were put together in the course of a few days. Obviously, there are reports of coercion. So you're seeing vote totals in excess of 90% for joining the Russian Federation. Not really how you would conduct a legitimate referendum, however. But there is a little bit of a tension here in that this is a very escalatory move by Russia at a time where they're clearly faced with some manpower problems.
Absolutely. It does seem like this is a power play of almost last resort. We saw just last week President Putin call up 300,000 reserve forces. Now, we've heard from the Pentagon that the first groupings of these reserve forces have reached Ukraine territory, but we also know that if they've already reached it, there isn't a significant amount of training that these forces are being provided before going to the front lines. And when we think about that, we know that a lot of these 300,000 reserve forces are either retired or people who have been out of the military for a handful of years. So they don't have recent training, and they're getting pushed right to the front lines, which also demonstrates their manpower issues. We heard that the mercenary group, the Wagner Group, is going to Russian prisons to try and recruit convicted felons to fight on the battle lines. So all of these different pieces sort of point back to the issue that President Putin's at a significant loss of bodies and needs to replace them. And we have seen even backlash in Russia from this. We saw as soon as he made the announcement of calling up the reserves, we saw airlines get booked completely. We saw photos of border crossings being backed up for miles. And so it really does show that there are some divides that are cracking in Putin's facade.
And the U.S. Embassy has called for Americans to leave Russia.
Absolutely. The U.S. Embassy not only called for them to leave, they also said that if you are a dual national, they may not recognize your American citizenship and may put you towards the front lines.
Right.
And so we heard them say that. We also heard them say that Americans should not be participating in these protests. We've seen almost 2,500 people be arrested in Russia protesting the war. And so the embassy doesn't want the Americans being involved in that.
So Russia's escalating the war. We're seeing a little bit of political instability at home under Russian President Vladimir Putin. There are manpower challenges, but there's now concerns that the way that maybe Putin maneuvers around all of this is putting us at heightened risk of nuclear war. What is the source of this concern? Why do people think that that's a greater risk now than earlier in the conflict?
So what we have to remember is that DOD and the administration has said Putin is not necessarily a rational actor. So we have to take that into account as we discuss this conversation. And his calculation is his back is up against the wall. The war has gone on for 7 months now, which is 6 more than he expected. He doesn't have the manpower to keep going long term. So the one card he has left to really play is using a tactical nuclear weapon, or using a low-grade nuclear weapon in Ukraine. Now, this would prompt an unprecedented response from the administration and from NATO, but we don't really know what that looks like. Obviously, the Pentagon and the White House aren't broadcasting these plans to tip off the Russians to what they would do in response. But we've heard that the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, said they would be catastrophic consequences, which demonstrate just the severity that both they're taking it and the heightened level of concern that there is at this time in the war.
But Putin seems to think, he could be wrong given the threats of catastrophic consequences, but he seems to think that he can do a little nuclear escalation that will be sufficient to win the war, defeat the Ukrainians, but not enough to trigger a nuclear response from the United States and the West.
Absolutely. So the U.S.'s stance on nuclear weapons has always been mutually assured destruction.
Right.
Russia's nuclear posture has always been, we might be able to get away with a small one if we don't think the U.S. would be inclined to retaliate and nuke all of Russia and start a nuclear war.
Right.
And so it really is a game of chicken, and it's unclear how Putin will go forward. But throughout this entire war, it's pretty clear that he shouldn't be underestimated when his back is against the wall.
So closer to home, although there are Russian implications to this too, you've covered a report that came out that details numbers about Americans detained abroad without justification, and the trends in this area seem pretty disturbing.
Yeah, so the Foley Foundation, which is named after James Foley, a reporter who was killed by ISIS almost a decade ago now.
Right.
The report found that the number of Americans who are being held abroad has gone up during the past 10 years to the previous 10, and also that the number of countries wrongfully holding Americans has grown nearly 5 times. And so it really does demonstrate that the administration needs to get a handle on what they call hostage diplomacy, or the use of, tactic of taking Americans as political pawns to leverage the United States for whatever they want. And so the report was very timely because the U.S. just freed Mark Frerich from the Taliban, and he'd been held there for 2 years. There are ongoing conversations between the U.S. and Russia regarding Paul Whelan and Brittany Griner. And while the U.S. has publicly acknowledged that they've provided a substantial proposal to the Russians, we don't hear anything imminent about either of their returns.
And they've never really confirmed, I mean, we think we know who they're going to offer, but the U.S. has never really confirmed what the contents of that significant offer is.
That's right. And we should also note that the two sides did agree to a deal that got a former Marine, Trevor Reed, home this spring. And so at the time, the administration said his health had deteriorated to such a level that they felt it was prudent for them to get him back at that specific moment.
Right.
It's unclear right now if there's that same dire urgency to get either Brittany Griner or Paul Whelan back.
But it's always concerning because when you deal an asset to get a detained American back and you don't get everybody back, that's one fewer concession that you can make to potentially bring back those other Americans.
Absolutely, and that's a concern we've heard from the Whelan family. But at the same time, earlier this month, the president spoke with both the Griner and the Whelan families and met with them, which was a big moment, or a significant moment for them, as they have been requesting meetings with the president.
Right. Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.